Imagine this for a moment. It's the early 1970s. Washington, D.C. is a city still scarred from the riots of 1968. The streets are restless, neighborhoods are struggling, and families are doing their best just to hold on. Now picture being a parent during that time. You send your daughter out to run a simple errand, or maybe she's just walking home from a friend's house, but she never makes it back. Hours turn into days, and the unthinkable happens. Her body is found near a busy highway. Between 1971 and 1972, this nightmare became a terrifying reality for at least 6 families in D.C. The victims were all young black girls, between the ages of 10 and 18. Each one disappeared from her community. Each one was later discovered near the freeways that cut through the city. And each one left behind a trail of grief and unanswered questions. The press called the killer the Freeway Phantom, a name that still lingers in Washington more than 50 years later. This wasn't just one tragedy. It was a pattern, a series of abductions, assaults, and murders that terrified the community and baffled investigators. The killer taunted police. At one point he, or possibly she, left behind a handwritten note on one of the victims signed Freeway Phantom, as if mocking the authorities, daring them to catch him. Yet, despite the FBI, the Metropolitan Police, and decades of renewed interest, the case remains unsolved. 6 young lives were stolen. Families never got justice. And today, the identity of the Freeway Phantom is still a mystery. Now, half a century later, investigators are once again turning to this case. Thanks to advances in forensic science, especially DNA testing, there's hope that answers might finally be within reach. In fact, as recently as 2021, the FBI announced new efforts to re-examine old evidence. Journalists, podcasters, and community members are demanding the same thing the families have wanted all along: truth, closure, and accountability. This story isn't just about a string of murders. It's about a city in turmoil, a community that felt ignored, and the haunting silence left behind when children go missing and never return home. Today, we're going to revisit the Freeway Phantom Murders. We'll look at the victims, the timeline of the crimes, the investigation that followed, and the suspects who were considered. And we'll ask the same question that has haunted DC for decades. Who is the Freeway Phantom, and why has he never been caught? So settle in, because to understand the weight of this mystery, we need to start where all true crime stories should start, with the victims themselves. To understand this case, we have to step back in time. Washington, D.C., in the early 1970s, was a city divided. Just a few years earlier, after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., entire neighborhoods had erupted in riots. Businesses were burned, homes were destroyed, and many families never fully recovered. By 1971, poverty was concentrated in certain parts of the city, especially in communities east of the Anacostia River. For black families living there, life was already tough. Parents worked multiple jobs. Streets weren't always safe. And there was a deep, painful sense that police didn't treat their neighborhoods with the same urgency as wealthier, whiter parts of the city. It's in this atmosphere of tension, neglect, and quiet resilience that the Freeway Phantom struck. The first known victim was Carol Spinks, just 13 years old. It was April 25, 1971. Carol had gone to a 7-Eleven near her home to pick up groceries for her mom. Nothing unusual, just an everyday errand. She never came back. 6 days later, her body was found along I-295. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. For her family, that short trip to the store turned into a lifetime of grief. Then came Darlenia Johnson, 16 years old. She disappeared on her way to work at a summer job. Her body was discovered not far from where Carol had been found, near the same stretch of highway. The pattern was beginning, though police at first struggled to connect the dots. Not long after, the youngest victim of all, Brenda Crockett, just 10 years old. Brenda was walking to the store when she vanished. Hours later, her mother received a chilling phone call. It was Brenda's voice. She told her family she had been abducted by a man, but strangely, she spoke as if she was being told what to say. Minutes later, she was gone again. By the next morning, her body was discovered along Route 50. 10 years old, still a child, and yet she became the third known victim of the Freeway Phantom. The killings continued. Nenomoshia Yates, 12 years old, was found strangled in October of 1971. Brenda Woodard, 18, vanished after leaving a dinner with friends. Her body was discovered near Prince George's County. This time, something unusual was left behind. a handwritten note tucked into her coat pocket. It read, quote, "This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women. I will admit the others when you catch me if you can. Freeway Phantom." The writing offered no clear leads, but it showed arrogance. Whoever wrote it wanted attention. The final known victim was Diane Williams, 17 years old. In September of 1972, she was on her way home after visiting her boyfriend. She never arrived. Her body was later found near I-295, the same highway that had claimed so many before her. 6 young girls, all black, all taken from their families. All of them discovered near the freeways that crisscrossed Washington, D.C. 6 lives cut short in the span of just over a year. For the families, the grief was unbearable. For the community, the fear was overwhelming. Parents were terrified to let their daughters walk to school, go to the store, or even wait at the bus stop. And layered over all that fear was anger. Many believed the police weren't doing enough because the victims were black, because they came from poor neighborhoods. It's a suspicion that still lingers today. So what really happened to these girls? Who was stalking them, abducting them, and leaving their bodies by the freeways? To answer that, we need to walk through the timeline, step by step, and look closely at how each crime unfolded and what investigators actually found. We've just met the victims, 6 young girls whose lives were stolen far too soon. Now, let's trace the timeline of how these murders unfolded, one after another, and how the Freeway Phantom left his mark on Washington, D.C. It all began in April of 1971. 13-year-old Carol Spinks disappeared on her way back from the store. For nearly a week, her family searched, hoping she'd walk through the door. Instead, her body was discovered near Interstate 295, tossed along the side of the road as if her life had meant nothing. The brutality was clear. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The case should have set off alarms, but in a city already struggling with crime, it didn't yet stand out as the beginning of a serial pattern. Just 2 months later, in July of 1971, Darlenia Johnson, 16 years old, never made it home from work. Her body was found along the same highway where Carol's had been left. Again, signs of sexual assault. Again, strangulation. The similarities were impossible to ignore, yet investigators hesitated to declare a serial killer was on the loose. Then, in July of that same summer, the youngest victim appeared, Brenda Crockett, only 10 years old. This case added a chilling new element. Brenda actually called her home twice during the night she disappeared. Both times she sounded frightened, but also strangely scripted, almost as if someone was forcing her to repeat words. She told her mother she had been abducted by a man, then quickly added details that didn't seem to fit. Minutes later, the calls ended. By morning, her body was found along U.S. Route 50. Investigators believe the killer made her phone home as part of his twisted game, perhaps to mislead police or simply to inflict more cruelty on her family. By now, 3 girls had been killed within just a few months, each one abducted from her community, each one left near a major roadway. Fear spread quickly. Parents in D.C. were terrified to let their daughters out of sight. In October 1971, Nenomoshia Yates, only 12, was discovered near the freeway. Her death reinforced the pattern: another young black girl, another abduction, another body placed near the roads that cut through the city. Then came November 1971, when 18-year-old Brenda Woodard disappeared after leaving dinner with a friend. Her body was found near Prince George's County, Maryland, not far from the city's border. And this time, the killer left something behind: a handwritten note stuffed into her coat pocket. The words were cold, almost taunting. It read, "This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women. I will admit the others when you catch me if you can. Freeway Phantom." That note was the first direct communication from the killer. But instead of providing answers, it only deepened the mystery. Handwriting analysis couldn't tie it conclusively to any suspect. To this day, it's one of the most infamous pieces of evidence in the case. Finally, in September of 1972, 17-year-old Diane Williams left her boyfriend's house and never arrived home. Her body was later found near I-295, strangled like the others. Diane's death marked the last confirmed victim of the Freeway Phantom. From April 1971 to September 1972, just 17 months, 6 girls were taken, abused, and killed. Their bodies were all left in locations that seemed carefully chosen. The killer clearly knew the geography of D.C. and the surrounding highways. Some victims were held for days before being killed, while others were murdered quickly. But one detail was consistent: the dump sites. Almost every body was left within view, or just out of view, of major freeways. It was as if the Phantom wanted the city to see, wanted his crimes to be discovered. And yet, for all these similarities, investigators struggled. Crime scene forensics in the 1970s were limited. DNA testing didn't exist. Fibers, fingerprints, and handwriting were about the best tools they had. Even so, evidence often went missing or was contaminated by too many people handling it. Still, one thing became certain: this wasn't random. The killer had a method. He targeted vulnerable girls, abducted them on short trips close to home, and left their bodies where they'd be found quickly. It suggested someone confident, familiar with the neighborhoods, maybe even living among them. The community gave the killer his name, the Freeway Phantom, because of where the victims were left. And with each discovery, panic grew. Parents in D.C. kept their children inside. Newspapers published warnings. But the Phantom remained free, watching, choosing, striking again. So here's the question: how could someone abduct and kill 6 young girls in such a short period, in a city full of police and FBI offices, without ever being caught? The answer lies in the investigation, or perhaps more accurately, in its failures. Let's turn now to the detectives, the suspects, and the mistakes that would come to define this case. By the time Diane Williams was found in September of 1972, it was undeniable. Washington, D.C. had a serial killer. The Freeway Phantom was real, and he was terrorizing the city. But knowing it was one thing. Stopping him was another. The investigation fell to both the Metropolitan Police Department and the FBI. On paper, that sounds like a powerful partnership. But in reality, the task force was underfunded, overwhelmed, and working without the forensic tools we take for granted today. DNA testing didn't exist. Even fingerprint comparisons were limited. Detectives were left with fibers, vague witness statements, and that chilling handwritten note. From the very beginning, mistakes piled up. Crime scenes were trampled by curious officers and reporters. Evidence wasn't always logged properly. In some cases, samples degraded before they could even be tested. And perhaps worst of all, many families felt that police simply weren't giving the case the urgency it deserved, because the victims were young black girls from poor neighborhoods. One mother told reporters that when she begged detectives for updates, she was brushed aside. Another parent said they only found out their daughter had been linked to the Freeway Phantom by reading it in the newspaper. That sense of neglect ran deep, and it still echoes through the community even 50 years later. But what about suspects? Over the years, investigators chased down many leads. One of the most serious was Robert Askins. Askins was a convicted murderer with a disturbing history of violence against women. He had been in and out of prison, and at one point, he even worked as a computer technician for a government agency, giving him both the intelligence and the access that could fit the Phantom's profile. Handwriting experts noted that his writing bore similarities to the infamous note found on Brenda Woodard. He certainly seemed like the perfect suspect. But here's the problem: there was never enough evidence to connect him directly to the crimes. Investigators searched his home, interviewed witnesses, even monitored him for years. Still, nothing stuck. Askins eventually died in prison on unrelated charges, never formally tied to the Freeway Phantom murders. Another theory pointed far outside D.C. Some wondered if the Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway, who would later confess to dozens of murders across the country, could have been responsible. Ridgway had spent time in the Washington, D.C. area during the early 1970s. The idea was tempting. Maybe this was an early chapter in his killing career. But once again, the evidence wasn't there. No direct link was ever established, and the theory faded. There were also whispers of local suspects, men who lived in Anacostia or nearby neighborhoods, who knew the terrain, who might have blended in easily. Some theories suggested the killer had a job that gave him freedom of movement, like a cab driver or delivery worker. Others believed he was a police officer, or at least someone familiar with law enforcement, because he seemed so good at avoiding detection. But none of these theories ever led to a conviction. So what went wrong? Looking back, several failures stand out. First, the lack of forensic technology. If the Phantom had struck just 2 decades later, DNA might have solved the case. Second, the contamination of evidence. Crime scenes weren't secured the way they are today. And finally, the social reality. The lives of black girls simply weren't prioritized by the system in 1971 the way they should have been. That lack of urgency likely cost investigators their best chance of catching the Phantom while he was active. But the story doesn't end there. In 2021, on the 50th anniversary of the first murder, the FBI announced it was re-examining the case. Old evidence was sent to labs for new DNA testing. Families of the victims were interviewed again. And for a moment, there was hope. Then, in 2023, the Washington Post published a deep investigation, highlighting not just the failures of the past, but the determination of the present. It quoted family members still waiting for answers, and it reminded readers that unsolved cases don't just fade away, they leave scars that never fully heal. Around the same time, the podcast Through the Cracks dug even deeper, telling the story not just of the murders, but of the community's frustration at being ignored. And now, in 2025, we know this much. DNA has been tested, but no definitive match has been made. The FBI hasn't announced a breakthrough. The families are still waiting. The Freeway Phantom remains a shadow, a mystery, an open wound in Washington's history. Which brings us to the haunting question. If all these resources, all these decades, and all this technology still can't solve the case, what does that say about justice? Some would argue the Phantom got lucky. Others believe the mistakes of the 1970s doomed the investigation from the start. But either way, the result is the same: 6 families without closure. And that forces us to ask, what lessons should we take from this? What can society learn when the most vulnerable among us are the ones most easily forgotten? As we close in on 55 years since the murders began, the Freeway Phantom case stands as both a mystery and a warning. Next, let's step back and look at the bigger picture. The legacy of this case, what it tells us about the city, about justice, and about memory. Half a century has passed, and the name Freeway Phantom still lingers like a shadow over Washington, D.C.'s 6 young girls. Carol, Darlenia, Brenda, Nenomoshia, Brenda, and Diane were taken too soon. Their families never received justice. Their community never found peace. The case reminds us of 2 painful truths. First, how deeply injustice can cut when certain lives are treated as less urgent, less valuable. And second, how limited technology once was. Today, DNA and forensic science solve cases that once seemed impossible. But in the 1970s, those tools simply didn't exist. And so we're left with unanswered questions. Who was the Freeway Phantom? Was he someone the community knew? A stranger passing through? Or did he blend into the city, hiding in plain sight all along? Imagine if DNA breakthroughs finally unmasked him. Would it bring closure? Or would it only deepen the sorrow, knowing justice came too late? Now, I want to hear from you. Who do you think the Freeway Phantom really was? Do you believe modern technology, maybe a single surviving DNA fragment, could still crack this mystery? Share your theories, your thoughts in the comments. Because even now, more than 50 years later, these girls deserve to be remembered, not just as victims of a nameless killer, but as daughters, sisters, and friends whose lives mattered. Thank you for listening to Cold Case Files, the Freeway Phantom Murders. If this story moved you, if it made you think, please subscribe so you don't miss the next case we uncover. And remember, though decades have passed, the voices of Carol, Darlenia, Brenda, Nenomoshia, Brenda, and Diane have not been silenced. They are still here, waiting for justice, waiting not to be forgotten.